Many people put their trust in their physical beauty, their diplomas, their job, their health, their physical strength, their economic status, their bank accounts, or their possessions. Yet all these things are finite and will not last forever.
This is Mission 66, an adventure through God's Word. This program is brought to you by TWR in partnership with the Bible teaching ministry of Dr. Luis Sayao. We're currently in the book of Genesis. You can follow along with your downloadable study guide at mission66.org. Now let's dive in with our teacher, John Matthews, and co-host, Esther Sisulu.
Welcome again, dear friends, as we study the Bible a chapter at a time. And right now, we're in a series of studies on the book of Genesis, where we've now come to chapter 12. Now, have you ever set out on a trip and discovered you were lost and you didn't know where you were going? Well, Abraham was told by God to go, but he didn't tell him where. Well, today our teacher John Matthews will present the theme, A Route with No Map.
Thank you so much, Esther, and a very warm welcome to Mission 66. Wherever you join us from today, it's so good to be with you. And here we are in Genesis, and we're at chapter 12. Chapter 1 to 11 was Moses' account of humanity's beginnings. The creation account up to the great flood of Noah and the confounding of the languages then at the Tower of Babel. And today, chapter 12 begins another section dealing mainly with the life of Abraham and the start of God's plan to redeem humanity from sin and from death. This is chapter 12. Let's read it together. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you." You see, Abram was born into a society of Baal worshippers in Ur of the Chaldees. But God chose him out from among those Baal worshippers to leave and follow a path of faith. And you know, God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And he still calls people out from every tribe, tongue, and nation to be his followers and true worshippers of him. Notice also that God doesn't tell Abraham where he's going to be taking him or where he's going. He's going somewhere. And as he went, God would lead him and show him the destination later. It required faith. Truck drivers will tell you it's nearly impossible to turn the wheel of a truck when it's parked, but if that truck is moving, even by inches, you can turn the wheels in any direction that you want. Same thing with a ship. You can't steer a ship that's dead in the water. But if that ship is moving even a tiny, tiny bit, you can steer it anywhere. And I think it's similar here. If we want to be used by God, we have to begin moving in order for him to steer us. Perhaps we want to serve God overseas. Well, why don't we start by reaching the people where we live right now? We have to start somewhere, and it's God who will guide the way. Next comes verse 2, where God says to Abram, "And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So God establishes a covenant with Abraham, a promise to be fulfilled in the future, that he'd possess the land, he'd father a great nation of people, and he would enjoy the protection and the blessing of God. Verse 4, "So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot, who was his nephew, went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. So they are clearly well blessed and rich in goods and livestock. And when they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. And then the Lord appeared to Abram again and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. So Abram's on the move again following the death of his father Terah in Haran, and the Lord leads him right to where he was supposed to be. And here the Lord reveals to him that this was indeed the land that would be given to him and his descendants. And at this point, Abram builds the first of many altars to the God who had appeared to him. And verse 8 says, "From there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord." Another altar near Bethel, a place that actually is going to figure heavily in the future of Israel. And here, I believe, is where Abram learnt how to pray, because before this he'd only been a good listener, really. Remember, the idols of the Chaldees didn't interact as God does. But now Abram is learning how to call upon God by name and interact with him. What a thought that is. And now in verse 9, we see, and there's something encouraging about this for all of us, that Abram, this hero of faith, as he's sometimes described, was not a perfect man. Who is? None of us are. We're all subject to human weaknesses, doubts, fears, periods of outright disobedience. And we see a little bit of this here with Abram, who journeyed on, still going toward the Negeb. Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. When Abram was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai his wife, "I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake." When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake he dealt well with Abram. And he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, and camels. Abram knew that he was a traveller in a foreign land, and he feared that the people in Egypt were going to kill him. And so he allows his fear to cloud his judgment and his decision-making. And don't we often have a tendency to fear the worst? We're overwhelmed with what sometimes I call the what-ifs of life. We borrow trouble and worry from what might happen instead of trusting God. You know, worry is very often believing a lie. And that lie is this life is all there is, and that our spirits and our souls are going to die with our physical bodies. And it was this worry that causes Abram to sin and lie, saying that his wife was his sister. He's really thinking of himself here. He didn't care so much if one of the Egyptians would try to take Sarai for a wife. But verse 17 says this, "But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh calls Abram and says, 'What is this you've done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go." And Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. So what is this? Well, this is a lack of faith, and Abram's lack of faith results in needless suffering, not only for Pharaoh and his family, but what about poor Sarai? What distress she must have suffered with her husband effectively ready to abandon her just to save his own neck. Well, it turns out mercifully that Pharaoh was not a killer and thief, as Abram may have imagined, but in fact he was a reasonable man. And at a time where Abram potentially may have been able to help Pharaoh by teaching him about something that he knew of this God of heaven, that wasn't possible, because it ends with Abram being totally abashed and getting lectured by Pharaoh. And I think many of us will relate to what Abram must have felt in his soul, because this was a low point in his life. And, well, we've all had low points, and we've all had those moments where we just don't understand, and maybe we've drifted from God, or we don't even know him. And that is a low point, and we've all of us been there.
You're listening to Mission 66, and I'm Esther, your host, and of course I'm here with a few questions. And, I think that the story of Abraham is just so intriguing, and I'm really enjoying it right now, John. But I do want us to go back really quickly and review just a few things for a moment. Firstly, what were the terms of the Abrahamic covenant that God made with Abraham?
Well, God told Abraham, when he was still named Abram without the additional H and A, that he would be a great blessing, and that his blessing would reach his entire family into the future, into future generations, and that God was going to make a great nation out of him. Well, of course, this seemed completely impossible, because his wife Sarah had no children, and both of them were past the age of childbearing. So he could only have legitimate children through Sarai, and now suddenly they were not only at risk of dying because of this severe famine, but they're at risk of dying of old age before God had been able to fulfill his promises. What's happening here? Well, God's certainly not worried about the same things that we're worried about. He certainly relates to our concerns, but he's not worried in that way that we are. And he's never outsmarted, never outnumbered, and he's never late. So once again, God intervenes in Abram's life, as if to say, no matter the circumstances, no matter how great the problems and the threats that appear, I laugh at impossibilities, and my promise will be kept. God has given his word, and his word, Esther, what wonderful news, his word never fails. His promise may not be fulfilled right away. Sometimes, and very often, it is delayed, or delayed as it seems to us, but God's plans are not always according to human expectations. So the promise that God makes to Abraham was going to be fulfilled, and he believed that it would, did Abraham. We have to remember that the God of Abraham is the only God there is. So the same God that takes care of Abraham also takes care of us, because the promise made to Abraham doesn't only include Abraham, but it includes a whole bunch of people that came after him who would demonstrate the same unshakable faith in God.
As you talk about this, John, I think about the many migrants today, and how, these people, they head off to a place that they hope would be their own quote unquote promised land. And some may even journey out with simply the clothes on their back. I just think of how those that may be listening right now can identify with this theme, the route with no map.
Yeah, absolutely, Esther. So many people in our world today left with no choice but to go, but to move, because of the circumstances that occur in the countries and the places where they live. Jesus actually predicted, didn't he, that many shall run to and fro and knowledge shall increase. And we see that today. We see elements of that today. Many migrants forced to leave their lives to seek a better life. But actually, it's more basic very often than that. Many forced to leave to survive without having any idea where they're going to end up. So the stories may sound similar, but they're different too, because Abraham didn't have to go anywhere. He could have stayed right there in Ur of the Chaldees. He was plenty rich enough where he was, but he had this strong conviction that God had called him to go without telling him where. Now, we have no detail in the Bible of exactly how this call came about. Only we're told that God had appeared to him. Verse 7. And this evidently happened several times. So Abraham has absolute faith in God, and the scriptural account will bear that out as God guides Abraham into the land of Canaan. And we're also going to see, Esther, that almost the whole of the rest of the Bible will describe the results of Abraham's obedience and how God fulfills his promises and how God's promises are enabled through one man's obedience. And that is a lovely thing.
You know, John, sometimes in life we may experience those moments of exasperation, and we just resign ourselves to saying, well, I don't like my family. I can't stand them. I can't stand my job. I think God is telling me to leave and I need to go somewhere else. Look, I can 100% relate to having been in that situation. But I think that we shouldn't be so quick to say those things or perhaps even come to those conclusions because of what we may be feeling in that moment in our lives.
Yeah, well, thank you for your honesty, Esther. And you know, I've been in that situation myself, as I'm sure many people who are listening to Mission 66 have as well, or maybe are right now. They're at a point in their lives where they're thinking, look, whatever my circumstances, I need to go. I've had enough. There's just too much anxiety and stress around me. But what you said at the end there, I think, is really true. Proverbs 16 verse 9 says, we can make our plans, but it's the Lord who determines our steps. It's God who guides the steps of those who fear and trust him. And so I think it's a real point that you make there, because I think we need to be careful not to act irresponsibly or do things off the cuff without seeking God, or try to use the Bible to excuse our actions, or perhaps even blame God for our decisions that are exclusively ours. But clearly here, Abraham is not running away from problems and difficulties. In fact, if anything, we're going to see his troubles will only increase. Abraham's story was his story, and so it's not to necessarily be repeated by others.
Wow, that was powerful. That definitely is a point for me to ponder on personally, John. Well, I'd like for us to look at verse 10, because here now we see that there was a famine in the land and Abram went to Egypt. But I do wonder if it was God who sent the famine. And if that was the case, was this supposed to be a test for Abram? And if that was the case, why didn't he just stay in the land that God gave him and just trust that God would take care of him?
Yeah, important question, because it teaches us that even if God calls us to do something, that something is rarely easy. And that's because of the nature of our sin, of our human nature, where we so often try to rely instinctively on ourselves, and God then takes us through a process where we learn to rely on him. In Abraham's case, we see that he begins this journey, which was an enormous undertaking. He's seen his father die, and now he's confronted as the person leading all these guys, this caravan of people, with a huge famine. And so you can imagine Abraham quite rightly asking himself, well, why on earth would God send me here just to die of famine? Is God really the one guiding me here? Is it really him? Have I done the right thing? Doubtless he would have thought along those lines. But what this is a test of faith. So what's he going to do? Some feel that Abram disobeyed God by going to Egypt instead of trusting God to keep him alive in the promised land. But let's put ourselves in his place. He's got his family and many others depending on him, huge flocks and herds of livestock to provide for, and he uses the brain that God has given him. He reasons it out, and so he goes to Egypt where there's food. And you know what? I think if that were me, I would have done exactly the same. In the New Testament, when the Apostle Paul was called by God to go on missionary journeys, he faced hardships because of it, had to work for a living in addition to preaching. So, look, we shouldn't expect that it's always going to be easy, and very often it's not. There's a proverb that says, if you faint in the day of adversity, your strength is small. And really, as the Bible says, God's strength can only be perfected in our weakness when we realize we are totally dependent upon Him, in our total reliance on and in Him.
John, don't you find that sometimes as people, we assume that if someone is going through a time of difficulty, that there must be some kind of sin or some kind of error in their lives?
Some people might believe that, Esther, but it's nowhere near to the truth. It's nowhere near close to adding up. It's a complete misunderstanding of the Christian walk. Suffering is a key experience for those who are to be used by God. And we see those who were used greatly by God through the ages. Suffering was their theme. So that assumption is frankly ridiculous. We often don't understand why good people suffer, and our role is to support and encourage and be there for them. But when we start to judge people in that way, well, then we ourselves are guilty.
Well, I'm glad that we had that opportunity to clarify that point, John. So, Abram, the father of faith, he travels down to Egypt, and then he tells lies to try to save his life. How do we reconcile that?
Well, it's an interesting question because we know that sin has consequences and that persistently doing the wrong thing is not going to lead to positive outcomes in our life. So that is very clear. Sin has a consequence and it destroys us ultimately if we continue down that path. But there's a point to be made here because suffering is a key experience as well for most of those who are used greatly by God through the ages and in the Bible. And we often don't understand why good people suffer. And so our role is to support, encourage, and be there for them.
Well, I am glad that we had that opportunity to clarify that and make that point, John. All right, so here's Abraham, the father of faith. He travels down to Egypt, and then he tells lies to try to save his life. What comments can we make on that?
Well, you're right, because Abram lies to Pharaoh, saying that Sarai really is his sister, and it was an intentional deception, and he's at fault. And therefore Pharaoh and his court, acting innocently, think that she's a single woman and is available for marriage. But God has to intervene again, and he doesn't allow any of these men to touch Sarai. And many people ask, is God supporting a lie? Is he covering up for Abram? And look, Abram was no superhero. He had human frailties, as every one of us does. But we have to remember where Abram had come from, because in Ur of the Chaldees, this sort of thing may well have been common. He makes a mistake, possibly out of ignorance, and later we'll see that his son Isaac commits exactly the same fault, actually, in his travels. And they didn't have the whole light of divine revelation yet either, Esther. You know, the law of Moses hadn't been given. The codes of right conduct hadn't yet been established. So consider just how great God is, who's able to work through history, through the imperfections of human actions, using imperfect people doing rash things at times, but still working towards his goal, and that is the redemption of mankind.
Right, John. And I suppose just for clarity's sake, we shouldn't say that just because God permitted this sort of thing to happen in the past, that he'll permit it to happen today.
Ultimately, God is God, and God is all wise, and God is all loving, and God is all patient. So God does what is best, regardless of the age, regardless of the time. But truth is, we do have far more light revealed to us today. We have a complete Bible today. And so we have that knowledge, and so we have, in a sense, we know right from wrong because it's there clearly written in the Bible.
And once again, because of how clear the Bible is, we can't say that it says that we can lie just because, Abraham did it and he deceived in the process.
Well, look, lying in order to deceive is not the right thing. It's a sin. But it's also true that there is no sin that we can commit that God cannot forgive when we ask him for forgiveness.
Yeah, and you know what? That right there, that's the good news for all of us. And that's what we thank God for here on Mission 66. So, I guess we've come to our summary now, John. How can we wrap up chapter 12 of Genesis?
Yeah, let's do that, Esther. So what we've seen is the story of a man that we know as Abraham, who was on a route with no map. And what can we learn from what we've seen in this chapter? Well, it's certainly a lesson of faith, as described in chapter 11 of Hebrews, which says that Abraham went out not knowing where he was going. And Abraham is considered the father of all who live by faith. And why is that? Well, it's because he was in this really comfortable situation. Here he is in Mesopotamia. God calls him then, amidst that lovely comfort that we might think is a lovely comfort. And God calls him to leave those comforts of home and move away, trusting God to guide where he was going. Abraham had nothing to back up this divine calling, if not God's promise. But Hebrews defines faith as the certainty of something we cannot see. And Abraham believes God so strongly that he puts all of his hope in God. And so he sets out for this new land. And he wasn't going to be deterred by hardship or difficulties along the way. His walk was far from perfect, we know that. But he remains on the path which God has put him on, or which God is leading him on. He doesn't allow his heart to trust in his own stability, his own wealth, his own status or strength, or anything that he may have accomplished in life. And that is the main theme that we can apply to our lives today. And the question I'd ask is, where do we put our faith and our trust? In what is our ultimate hope? Many people trust in their physical beauty, their diplomas, their job, their health, their physical strength, their economic status, their bank accounts, their possessions. I've been there myself at times in life. But the truth is, those things are finite and they will not last forever. Jesus gives eternal life, which begins the moment you believe in the gospel. What is the gospel? It is the good news, the story of Jesus coming to earth and dying to take the punishment for our sins, that we can be free forever. And if we keep following him, he is going to lead us to a land of indescribable blessing.
Well, that's it for today, dear friends. We just want to thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Mission 66. We will be back again with you here, same time, same place, to continue our study in the life of Abraham. I'm Esther for John Matthews and our team saying goodbye and God bless you.
As Mission 66 comes to a close, be sure to download your free study guide at mission66.org. Deepen your daily devotion with insights from each episode, and let John and Esther lead you through the Scriptures. Get your study guide at mission66.org and be prepared for our next episode. There, you can also connect with us, ask questions, or donate to help Mission 66's worldwide outreach. Head to mission66.org. Mission 66 is made possible through Transworld Radio in partnership with Dr. Luis Sayao.